Good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started. All right, so I just want to say good afternoon and welcome to another webinar in our series of webinars on implementing multi-tiered systems of support for reading in secondary schools. I am Margaret Opetz, the Director of Research and Literacy at CAPD, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Nicole Vegar, who is a secondary multi-tiered systems of support coordinator in Minnesota. She has over a dozen years of experience as a literacy coach, special educator, and reading interventionist. Nicole champions the work of using assessment to understand the profile of readers. She has also led countless teams and teachers in using assessment to drive instruction, align reading interventions to readers, and evaluate the outcomes of systems. This is all in the service of achieving effective and equitable outcomes for students and families. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope that today's webinar will help you understand how to enhance adolescent literacy through interventions and progress monitoring. So for today's webinar, we're going to start by taking a look at adolescent literacy challenges, and then we'll discuss the tools that can really help us in identifying students' needs and the targeted interventions that are aligned to those needs. And then finally, we will discuss some effective progress monitoring, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions. Throughout the webinar, Nicole will share her experience leading the charge in a middle school in northern Minnesota. All right, so let's jump into adolescent literacy. And as I do this, I just want to make a note that when we're saying adolescent, there's a lot of definitions out there. And the definition that we're really focused on today is one used by many scholars. And it's really that focus on students in grades 4 to 9 when we see a big shift in what is expected of learners. And Nicole's perspective is coming from a middle school that serves students in grades 5 to 8. So that's who we're thinking about throughout our webinar. And a somewhat recent initiative by the Department of Education called the Reading for Understanding Initiative looked at what makes adolescent literacy different from early literacy. So within the researchers' findings from this initiative, I want to share a framework with you. So this is kind of maybe an overwhelming framework from what came from the research. But when we look at this, it really demonstrates the complexity of adolescent literacy. So within these nested circles, we'll kind of like see what makes adolescent literacy so much more complex than we maybe thought it was earlier in at least my career and what we've learned recently. So when we think about adolescent literacy, especially comprehension, it is complex for many reasons. Starting with the reader, we know that readers have individual characteristics that can contribute to comprehension successes or difficulties. And some of these can be cognitive or language skills. We can also think about motivation. If you've had a cycle of success, then you're probably going to be more motivated. But if you've had that cycle of like not achieving, you might be less motivated. We also know that background knowledge is huge and that varies for every reader. And these skills can greatly vary among readers. And as a result, some may find it more difficult to fully grasp the material, which can lead to inconsistent comprehension abilities. So that's really just the reader when we think about like that first part. But then when we put them into the context of the reading task, when we move from 3rd to 4th grade, we know that the task that students are asked to do is much more complex than what they were doing in the primary grades, and this can be difficult. So at the 4th grade and up levels, we might ask students to analyze or synthesize information. And these are difficult skills. These are even difficult for adults to do, and we're asking pretty young kids to do that as well. And then when we add it to this, we go to that next layer of the text. And the text for adolescent readers differs markedly from what they were confronting through 3rd grade. So we know that students are given much more complex text, and they're asked to think about it through a disciplinary specific lens, where they might be reading like a historian or reading like a scientist, and they have to know what that means and how that information differs across those types of texts. Then we go out to that next circle, and we know that the socio-cultural context is huge for adolescent readers. We know that this lens is really about like what is it like within like that social and cultural environment that students are in, and that influences reading. Social aspects are huge for adolescents, and we think that it's a pretty important component to take into consideration. And then finally, that leads to that outermost layer of reading comprehension. And really, all of those previous layers contribute to either successful or unsuccessful comprehension. And within the MTSS framework, it's really up to teachers and school leaders to figure out where's the breakdown occurring within comprehension. And unfortunately, we also know we know it's complex, but we also know that reading comprehension difficulties are not uncommon. So we have the latest NAEP results that came out a couple of weeks ago, and we see that over a third of eighth graders are reading below that basic level, which is more than ever before. So this is concerning because what that really means is that students are unable to identify those basic literary elements or identify the main idea, which I think we can all probably agree that that's a really like foundational skill to be able to identify like the main idea in a text. So this is all concerning, and we know that there are challenges that exist. So fortunately, we do have Nicole here who will be able to tell us about the work that they're doing to really kind of change the game for students. But I wanted to give a little bit more context before we kind of get to Nicole's story. While we know that the Reading for Understanding identified like what it means to be an adolescent reader and how different that is compared to primary students or elementary students, we also know that research had pointed us to comprehension and focusing on comprehension for a long time with adolescent readers. We kind of thought that if we just taught enough comprehension strategies, we'd get to the end result. But something that did come out of the Reading for Understanding initiative is the need for word level skills. And this is important because in fourth to sixth grade and up, there are no word level skills to be measured based on the Common Core state standards. So once you get beyond second grade, where it's doing phonics, and then third grade, which also includes some multisyllable words, we don't have that focus on word level skills. So students are very unlikely to get any type of support in the tier 1 setting to be able to break apart words at that word level. And then we also learned that through years of research, we've learned that comprehension really does require that accurate word recognition and decoding, being able to decode and recognize words automatically, which is very closely related to comprehension. So we know it predicts comprehension. So the better the word level skills are, the more likely you are to comprehend the text. So basically, all of this is to say that when we look at adolescent literacy challenges, the one thing that has come out the most recently through the research and specifically the Reading for Understanding initiative is that we really need to address foundational reading skills, and these really need to be at the word level initially to be able to support students in long-term success. So one of the things that also came out of the Reading for Understanding initiative is that we needed tools that will help to address adolescent literacy. And Nicole, do you want to talk a little bit about your searching for the right types of tools to use?
Yeah, so I work at a middle school in northern Minnesota, as you mentioned, and we've, for the last 10 years, been trying to figure out a way to screen students for reading issues and then align them with interventions and supports. And our experience really started with us using assessments that we already had at our disposal, things like our state test achievement results, looking at formative assessments in the classroom, which is grade level standards aligned, again, not including any word level assessments. And then looking at computerized assessments that we had access to, like STAR test or NWEA. And we would get these nice reports from Stranded Out. Our students need work in nonfiction text. Vocabulary is a primary issue for our students in needs. Our students struggle with finding the main idea. And we would set up these interventions, and we would really feel like we were scaffolding and supporting students through growing in those skills. And we would even have formative assessments that students could transfer those skills. And then when we asked them to take these screening assessments again, we would see that we were in just exactly the same spot and nothing had been improved. And so we've changed our screening assessments and our summative assessments that we look at multiple times, and every single time kind of landed in the same spot, which was we have not figured out how to meet the comprehension needs of our kids and find a tool that can capture any growth if we're making it.
Yeah, so one of the findings from the Reading for Understanding initiative was the need for an adolescent literacy diagnostic or screener that could really pinpoint those foundational skills. So that's how we really started to work together. You came and started to use Read Basics, and Read Basics is one of the tools out there that really can identify those foundational skills and the students' specific needs within those foundational skills. So within the framework of Read Basics, which was formerly known as RISE within the research world, the developers of RISE figured out, like, we know that there's these foundational skills. We know that they differ for adolescents, but here's what is tested. So there's a word recognition and decoding subtest, and then a vocabulary test. We also have morphology, sentence processing, reading efficiency, and reading comprehension. And something that came out of the development of this assessment was that we have these word level skills that really need to be intact before we move closer to reading comprehension. So the first three subtests really look at what are the word level skills? Do students have those? Are they able to recognize words automatically with ease, and can they do that fluently? And then moving to the sentence level skills, are they able to comprehend at that sentence level? Do they understand what the relationship is across sentences? And then finally to that passage level skill. So being able to comprehend at a complete passage level. And really the thought is that we want to be able to move from left to right across the screen to say, once these are intact, we can move closer to reading comprehension.
I think it's really important to point out the fluency and accuracy that these assessments, at least the first 5, assess frequently in secondary education, being that we focus mostly on the reading comprehension strands and vocabulary of the standards. Best practice, oftentimes in tier 1, looks like slowing down, critical thinking, interpretive type reading comprehension instruction. And so sometimes the value that secondary staff have on automaticity and fluency is not always present. And so knowing that this assessment is giving you that level of information and why it's important and foundational has been pretty life-changing for our building, and really a shift in thinking that we've never been tasked with doing with an assessment before.
Yeah. And okay, so one of the things that came out of the whole Reading for Understanding initiative using Read Basics, and specifically the word recognition and decoding subtest and comprehension test, was the determination of the decoding threshold. And if you haven't heard about this before, basically what researchers found over 3 years with the same students, so in a longitudinal study, they found that if you scored below 235 on the word recognition and decoding subtest, you had an unpredictable relationship with comprehension. So that meant that if I was below 235, my comprehension, like if you gave me comprehension strategies, it wasn't going to help. It was really my word level skills were impeding my ability to comprehend. And this was pretty transformational for you all at your school. So Nicole, I don't know if you want to share something about the decoding threshold and kind of how that helped you.
Yeah, I mean, it really helped us know where to start and where to prioritize, that we truly don't know the comprehension, the verbal vocabulary, our students' ability to complex sentence structures orally, we don't really truly know where student skills are at when they're decoding, when they're under or around that decoding threshold. So there's kind of no point in trying to target at those skills. We need to fix the decoding first, and then we'll find out what deficits, if any, we're left with. For our journey, this became very obvious when we started measuring students' writing, and we noticed that our students were making a lot of gains in their writing instruction because they had access to accommodations or digital tools that could help them write and spell. But yet we weren't seeing any change in our reading comprehension. So when we finally got our hands on this Read Basics test and saw our word recognition skills, it became very clear that our kids' oral language had been developing based on our Tier 1 instruction, but we weren't able to capture that in reading comprehension because we still had so many deficits in decoding skills.
Right. So by being able to see the word level skill and being able to look at decoding and word recognition, it kind of helped you decide like, where are we going to start? And I think I made this instead of that linear line like before, I made this a curvy path because this is not a simple solution. It's not like once you have the right tool, you have all of the resources that are needed. But it did really help you to pinpoint where you're going to start. So you started here with word recognition and decoding and decided like, what will it take for adolescent readers to be able to improve there? Would you like to share more about the word level skills that you kind of focused on?
Yeah, so I mean, we had a triage, right? Because we were faced with a reality that we were uncomfortable with, which was that we had too many students who were reading underneath the word recognition and decoding skills. And then we had our rooms filled with comprehension interventions. And so really finding the right people that were willing to do the learning to learn about structured literacies and targeted interventions in the decoding game was kind of where we started. We knew that we needed to start with our Tier 3 kids who had the most intensive need because that's how an MTS model kind of looks. You triage with where you can. And then once we found a tool and an intervention that we were using Progress Monitor to see gains with students, once we started getting them up to that decoding threshold, automatically for lots of groups of kids, we started seeing their comprehension raised, their vocabulary raised, their reading efficiency raised without any targeted instruction in those areas. So then we knew that this was a really valuable place to start, not just to help our neediest learners, but also there's a lot of kids who, if we could get them through all of the word recognition skills that they would need, they wouldn't need any more intervention from us. They already had the oral language to support the work that they were doing orally at grade level, and now we can help them transfer it to reading
Yeah,
connected.
I think it's important to note here too, when we're talking about word recognition and decoding, this isn't just phonics. I think phonics is kind of used as almost like a, once students have phonics in place, they're good to go. But this is really about a focus on not just letter to sound correspondence, but also breaking apart multisyllable words into syllables, but also using morphemes to break apart words into those word parts that carry not just the sound component, but also meaning. And we'll get into the more specifics later on. But yeah, you targeted word recognition and decoding because that was like the first area where you were like, okay, we have too many students below. And I will say Nicole and her team have not stopped there, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So when we look at figuring out like where are we going to go with instruction, we really do start on the left side of our instructional decision-making flowchart, and we look at word recognition and decoding. And then once students have those word level skills intact, they're able to read the multisyllabic words with ease. They're able to do that fluently. Then that's when students can really move on to more of that comprehensive reading where it's not just focused at the word level, but expanding into more of like a fluency-based intervention where they're reading sentences and passages. So I think that is just important to note, and we will talk more about those specific types of interventions in a little bit. So once Nicole and her team had the right tool, they were able to really focus on interventions. And Nicole had one time called this her Bible to me. So I think it's important to note that all of the interventions that Nicole and her team are trying are all research-based. And really a lot of them are coming from this What Works Clearinghouse Guide for providing reading interventions for students in grades 4 to 9. So of important note, here are the recommendations from this report, and this one came out in 2022. Um, but basically, the recommendations focus on students reading complex multisyllabic words, being able to decode those accurately and fluently. And then the next component would be providing purposeful fluency building activities. We want students to be able to read with ease, but we also want to do it intentionally. I know there was a period in my career where we thought if we just did enough repeated reading, it would fill in those word level gaps. But unless we have really those multisyllabic word reading skills intact, it's going to be really difficult to become more fluent. And then the next recommendation is really focusing on comprehension building practices to really just help students make sense of the text. Like, can you understand what you're reading? And then finally, the fourth one is really being able to present challenging text to students. This was a shift in the research base. At one time, it was thought that we should give students text that they can read, kind of like at their just right level. But this recommendation really showed us that even in intervention classes, we should be giving them challenging text, because if we're going to give students the opportunity to access grade level text, they need to be wrestling with these complex ideas and information while they are receiving interventions and have that teacher support. All right, so just in thinking about the targeted interventions that Nicole and her team used, I'm going to pass it over to you, Nicole, to kind of talk through what it is that you thought about and then how you selected those interventions.
So when we started this journey, we really looked at who's the profile of our readers, right? So we knew who those really intensive phonics tier 3 word decoders were, and we found that intervention that was research-based. We'll either use What Works Clearinghouse or ESSA to kind of find recommendations, but Read Basics has also been helpful in finding tools and resources. It was important to us that we had curriculums that had fully developed scope and sequences. You could read the 4 through 9 intervention guide and design strategies that you could do around content that might be helpful. But for us, we really wanted to open up our teachers' cognitive capacity to focus on the formative assessment that was happening in their rooms and their progress monitoring and interpreting the data instead of designing instruction and managing a scope and sequence. We thought experts who had spent lots of time and money investing in those scopes and sequences would be better suited to do that for us. So we started with finding research-based interventions. And when we looked at the 4 through 9 guidance and were able to find some tools that aligned, rewards curriculum is coming to mind from Voyager Sopri. Word Connections is a free one that we found on IES, and Strategic Adolescence Read Interventions from the SERP Institute. These really fit that like tier 2 profile. And so it seemed like that would also be a good place that we could start. They hit multiple subtests that we were flagged at risk. We could implement them rather quickly. They weren't isolated skills, so we knew that if a student maybe was flagged inappropriately, there also were other things that they could benefit that was more aligned to what they should be getting in tier 1. And then we could monitor their progress. And based off of how they were responding to the tier 2, we could decide if they were progressing well enough, if many of them were progressing well enough, or if it feels like we had maybe inappropriately paired reader profiles with interventions. We spent some time also studying each of the interventions. What are the parts of the reading puzzle or the reading rope that they spend the most amount of their time on, and then predicted what subtests and Read Basics they were most likely to affect, and in our progress monitoring, and then picked students who had those needs, but also those intensity of needs and kind of align them with those interventions.
Great, thank you. Yes, people are excited to hear what the interventions were again. So I'm going to go forward to that next slide and you can kind of
Okay.
talk through each of those.
Yeah, so unlike a lot of systems, we did really start in tier 3. A lot of the collective wisdom around MTSS is to start at tier 1. When we were doing our tier 1 work, we, again, exclusively focused on our standards, on rigorous instruction, and really were not seeing measurable impact of the work that we were doing. So when we decided to shift gears and focus on tier 3, we landed on, based on our data, and read basics, we landed on 95 rep as our tier 3 intervention for general education, or SPIRE, and then Lexercise for special ed students for our decoding and morphology and fluency building program. We also were able to incorporate rewards and word connection at the tier 2 level there. And then we discovered in our endeavors that there was a lot of morphological instruction that tier 1 should be doing that we had missed. And that also could get wrapped around some of those phonics components and fluency building. And so we tried out a program called LRAVE, actually, that Dr. Opatz had been on a study with. And we had really good results in our decoding and morphology building, but we did not see as much fluency building from that program. So we sought to find a multisyllabic word reading morphological program that also had fluency routines embedded. And the University of Minnesota has this project called Functional Morphology, which is the tier 1 instructional piece. I would also add that having a word identification and fluency program in tier 1, tier 2s, and tier 3s also allows us to think about exiting kids earlier from tier 3 into tier 2 or into tier 1, because we know exactly what type of instruction they're going to get. And when in our program, we see them as ready to be exited into those different tiers. So it's also been a little bit more, it's been efficient for us to do things that way.
Yeah, I wonder, I know we don't have the exact numbers, but I wonder if you can say something about, it was pretty inspiring to see when Nicole and her team of teachers implemented rewards or another multi-syllabic word reading intervention, how many students they were able to say they actually don't need any more support. And I think that was pretty encouraging in our work together to see that.
Yeah, we had 45 students just in 5th grade at the beginning of the year, which we weren't prepared for, but we had some teachers step up. And the nice
Is
thing
that
about
below the decoding threshold? 44.
that was below the decoding threshold. Yep. And so we recruited some gen ed teachers to help us do the rewards intervention, and we were able to send 30 of them back to tier 1 because we knew that the functional morphology curriculum was going to pick up where rewards had left off. So not every kid was as fluent as we would have wanted them to be at the end of that, but we know they're going to continue to get fluency practice. And then the students who didn't respond, we knew we needed to do more diagnostic assessments with, because their holes were going to be deeper. And then that rewards program, the multisyllabic word reading, was going to be able to meet the needs of.
Yeah, and I think something that's like really helpful, I think, in the way that you're describing it too, is the focus on tier 1 and really being able to like use the information to guide tier 1 instruction as well. I know in the work that we're doing at CAPTI with other schools, we're using Nicole's experience to really say like, well, let's also look at tier 1. Are there gaps that we're seeing kind of across the board to be able to say, it looks like this is a tier 1 problem, not just a tier 2 or tier 3 sort of problem.
The nice thing at the secondary level too, with having these subtests, is that you can use them repeatedly throughout the year to measure if what you're doing in tier 1 is working. And it's very gratifying for tier 1 teachers to see that the multisyllabic word routines they're using in tier 1 instruction are actually measurably changing the results of our students. And when we change those word recognition, morphology, and reading efficiency scores, and we see vocabulary and comprehension light up because our students can just simply read words better and read sentences better and read paragraphs better, then they all start to see that it is their job and value the focus on multisyllabic word reading.
Yeah, and that's like another thing that we've talked about, like how was the buy-in? And basically what you said is once we had the right data to kind of show where we were at and how we were improving, like buy-in wasn't an issue, which
No, yeah, it wasn't an issue once we were able to find the tools to measure, because we've been on the road of measuring things that mattered to us and not being able to capture growth. And so to see growth in our reading comprehension, even though we didn't focus on it, just because we focused on multisyllabic word reading and kids were able to read larger words better and quicker, every teacher wants to see that.
right. And okay, you kind of already mentioned this, but so we've talked about the data and then really using the data to like match students to the right interventions. So now we're going to move into progress monitoring and really thinking about how like this is the key to effective decision making. Nicole will talk about it, but there were several instances where you tried one intervention and after progress monitoring, you're like, this isn't quite the rate of improvement that we want. So kind of changing that up. So when we think about progress monitoring, we're really thinking about assessing academic performance. We want to be able to quantify a student's rate of improvement or how well they're responding to that intervention. And then we also want to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of instruction. Nicole mentioned they used one intervention and realized like they needed more, so they switched it up. And I think that's a really important piece here that they were constantly, well, I shouldn't say that in the past tense, they are constantly on that path of continuous improvement. So, Nicole, I'm wondering if you can kind of walk us through, oops, how you're kind of like going through that process of like making those instructional decisions and using that data to continually improve outcomes.
So it starts with screening, using the Read Basics assessment, and then whichever subtest we're looking at that we think are aligned with our interventions or the greatest student need, we kind of select those groups of students, and then we build programs based on students that have common profiles. And that's been a game changer for us because oftentimes before we had intervention groups that were just as diverse skill-wise as our typical gen ed classes or even our special ed classes. And so we found that we were like accommodating and differentiating in an intervention when really that's not what interventions are designed to do. So getting homogeneous groups together with similar profiles was 101, like step one and game changer for us. And then pairing those homogeneous groups with the profile of who they are data-wise, and then the intervention that was most likely to affect their needs or impact positively their needs, and then finding tools that we could use to measure those skills more frequently. And so the probably most common one is oral reading fluency.
And I'll go ahead and jump there.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just list those out for you.
Yeah, and we can come back. So we, when we know what we're teaching, we know what to measure. So when our programs are focused densely on fluency or phonics, then we want to make sure we're using things like oral reading fluency and nonsense words to determine whether those interventions are effective or not. We also sometimes will use screening data and we maybe aren't sure whether someone needs a tier 3 phonics intervention. So using like phonics inventories or a phonemic awareness measure like the PASS to determine how deep that student's foundational phonics and phonological processing needs are is just something that's really good to be well versed in so that you can kind of make sure that you're matching the tools with the students and the interventions that they're going to be assigned into. So once we determine the right progress monitoring tools for the intervention based on what's being taught, then every 2 weeks typically, we will conduct those assessments, and probably every 6 weeks we have scheduled time to look and reflect on rates of improvement and then determine if the intervention was done with fidelity and if the right students were put in it, and if not, or if so, sorry, then we want to problem solve around the student if they're not making improvement and use the expertise of our colleagues to help us come up with intensification or instructional shifts or possibly change interventions for students that aren't making adequate progress.
Yeah. And I think as we prepared for today too, you had some insight into like setting those realistic goals, but also recognizing that when students are maybe at like a third grade reading level, but they're in sixth grade, like what does it look like to really set goals that are realistic? Because we should be able to like kind of close the gaps a little bit quicker. So I wonder if you might talk about that.
Yeah, so usually when you adopt a progress monitoring program, whether it be Dibbles or FastBridge, there's guidance around how often you should administer the assessments, and that's usually based on how sensitive it is to change, particularly at different age groups. Sometimes that sensitivity changes. And then also what rates of improvement are normatively, like what's the average growth rate, what's realistic growth rate, what's aggressive growth rate. And you don't just think about where the student's starting, but you also think about the intensity of what you're about to provide them and what their past performance has been. And when a student is in general education tiers of support versus special education, you also get to think, what's a minimum rate of improvement that's going to get them caught up, and how long is it going to take them to get caught up? And in special ed, we can think more about like below grade level measurements when our instruction is at significantly below grade level. And then also maybe a rate of improvement for catch up isn't realistic for that child, but maybe we want to look at what their growth has been in the past and shoot for something a little bit more aggressive than that. And that's how we'll know that this thing is working better than the thing we tried before.
Right. Yeah, I think that's nicely said. Okay, let's move into those practical approaches to implementing and evaluating interventions. I know you've kind of talked about this, but I think it might be helpful to kind of um, just kind of like walk through the process that you took. And maybe I can walk through this unless you are ready to.
Um, well, so planning looks more like first we have to screen the students, determine the needs, prioritize the needs that are most foundational first, and then set up our groups. And then that planning and setting goals can happen, with the whole group individually, but I mean like similar goals for similar programs because you're targeting the same skills, or really individualized if you're in tier 3, and that's what that intervention allows for. And then when you set those goals, you deliver your instruction and you make sure that your feedback is aligned to the error mistakes that they make, and that that's something that you're monitoring, and that you're teaching with fidelity the intervention, and probably systematically that you have some sort of system for evaluating that fidelity. And then monitoring looks like also the progress monitoring for the teacher fidelity capturing there, but also the student progress monitoring data. And if students making adequate progress, the assumption is that the instruction you're providing is properly aligned to their needs and intense enough. And if it is inadequate, then you might look, is it, are they, maybe they're gaining mastery, but not fluency. Maybe they're increasing in accuracy, but not fluency. Maybe their fluency is increasing, but their accuracy is still low. And so then, you have to make the decision about if we feel like it's the appropriate intervention, but we want to intensify our instruction to increase the accuracy or the fluency, or nope, we don't think that that's doable within the intervention structure we have, so we want to actually change interventions. You're doing it with all of that knowledge in mind.
Yeah, yeah, great. Thank you for kind of just like recapping that and kind of explaining it again. So I think you've gone through a lot, and I think that there's like a few things that we can still kind of like go through, and these are some of like the key takeaways and kind of like your actionable steps, like how you got here, but then like kind of where you're still going. So within your framework, you are really like on this cycle of continuous improvement. And you started at the top there with that word recognition and decoding and like did a few iterations, right? Where you went through that process of saying like, are these the right interventions? What would work better? And then you move to that multi-component intervention, STARI, which is really fluency based. And then you're at that tier 1 instructional implication where you're saying like, maybe if we do this at the tier 1, like that's going to be helpful. But I'm also like, I think when we were kind of talking about today too, you had talked about like what will we do? Like how will we change instruction when students don't demonstrate improvement? Like what can we do? And then what does this look like in the future? Like what are our next steps kind of like in thinking about what's coming next? So I know I just like kind of described that, but I know you had a lot to say on this one. So can you kind of like walk us through kind of your thinking of like what is kind of next?
Yeah, so I think now we're thinking about, we've really honed in on a couple of programs that we think work well for us, not just because they meet the needs of our student, which I know the data is what we've led with, but also capacity is something that we've had to think a lot about, right? Which of these programs do you need to be a reading specialist to deliver? Which of these can we train a regular education, a special education teacher to deliver? Which of these programs work the fastest and with the least amount of effort? Which of these support the teachers as they're learning the program the best? And so we've kind of also really narrowed the tools that we're using or broadened when we had a need that was unmet based on some of those other factors that matter just as much as the student. In special ed, we really have changed a couple routes with our word recognition and decoding because in general education, tier 2 and tier 3, the interventionists get to say like, I need 5 students, I can't have 6, I'm not doing this intervention with fidelity if I have 6 kids in this room. And in special ed, they don't have that privilege. They have to design the programming for the kids that they have with the IEPs that have been designed by their teams and the minutes that they need. And so we've had to find other ways to increase capacity and to target skills for students who need to be in larger groups because that's what our data has told us the needs of our students are. And so as we continue to refine the programs that we're using and who's capable of doing them and where they're happening and in what setting, we also are thinking forward about, we actually have 2 grades that don't have very significant word recognition and decoding needs anymore. So how do we use this screening tool to look at where we started, which was thinking about vocabulary and sentence structure and reading comprehension, those tier 1 grade level standards at 8th grade, when we actually have MTSS profile that looks like 5% of our kids having significant decoding needs, 15% of our kids having a little bit of a risk area, and then 80% of our kids ready for grade level content. So how can we use this tool to advance and accelerate our learning in grade level standards rather than just thinking about intervention and who needs help and who needs it now?
Yeah. And I wonder if when you mentioned the word recognition and decoding, I thought you had a really clever solution for when you had very specific needs for students of using an online platform. So I wonder if you might talk about that.
Yeah, so we've always felt like a teacher, in the seat across from the kid, listening to the kid read, giving the feedback, like that's the best instructional design that we have. But we have kids who have struggle with attendance. Maybe they struggle socially with their peers. Possibly or they don't have any foundational needs, but they need some extra comprehension help. And we've found some multi-component online programs. Lexia Power Up is the one that we're trying out right now. We also have interventionists who are absent and have families and kids that are sick. And then we have students missing intervention. And so we have invested in a platform that has some reading acceleration and intervention instruction. And because why not? Because when the teacher's absent, no learning's happening. Because when the student's absent, that's a seat taken up from a kid who might be here. And because right now we don't have capacity for intervention and comprehension because of the word work that we're doing and the fluency building. And so when we finally got to the point where we were getting close to those grade level standards, we found some programs that we could use in gen ed settings for those reasons, for those students, because what we had wasn't meeting those needs.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great way to use technology is to like incorporate it in. Like we do believe that teachers are like the best to deliver interventions, but we also know that like technology exists and that there are those components that can like support us as well.
Yeah,
Um,
I also felt like since it was maybe our bubble kids that we weren't going to get to, like, well, why not then? So we're not putting anybody at risk who or denying someone access to an intervention that we've actually proven is working already, but these kids weren't going to get anything anyways, so let's try it.
yeah. I also appreciate you talking about like what does this look like beyond word recognition and decoding and kind of getting to those other skills. And I wonder if you might be able to share some insight in like what does that look like now? Like you basically taught the fifth graders last year, like out of basically needing most of them out of needing like very targeted interventions. So now what does that look like for them in sixth grade?
Well, so for the kids who we exited.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So when we exit students from a decoding intervention, we don't pay attention to percentile ranks with the screening tools and with the progress monitoring tools. We really look at the criterion that they've mastered and demonstrated mastery accurately and fluently within our diagnostic assessments that we use inside of word recognition and decoding. And so when we exit kids, we like to say that we finished the job. Like they're never going to come into contact again with phonics-based word recognition, multisyllabic instruction in tier one once we get them to the high school or in eighth grade. And so we don't see any sense in exiting a kid before they're done mastering all those skills, even if there might be a kid waiting who's lower, because we're going to offer that student the same service when it's their turn. And so that's how we kind of avoid it's like the revolving door of MTSS where you
Hmm.
screen and then you exit kids and then you just bring them right back in a year later because we didn't actually finish the job. And so for the students that we exit, we're helping them transfer those skills and we're still paying attention to them in screening and seeing if there's any regression or any uh cognitive or sorry, comprehension needs that might exist. So it's really just keeping an eye on them and then knowing that we have what programs we have in tier one and whether or not they were ready for them before the exit took place gives us a lot of comfort that they should continue to grow and maintain progress.
Hmm. And then you're also using word generation in the tier one setting, is that correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're trying that out in some social studies classes.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, word generation is a curriculum that the SERP Institute created, and it is open access. So anyone can um, go to their site and download it, and you can just start using it. It is research based and has been shown to be effective in especially middle school classrooms where there's a lot of content area knowledge being conveyed.
Yes.
All right. Well, Nicole, I want to say thank you for sharing your insight um, and yeah, sharing just your whole process. While we are at the end of our webinar, I would like to just say thanks again for attending. If you have any questions, we will stick around. But yes, thank you for attending our webinar. We have a series of webinars on multi-tiered systems of support. So if you missed our first one, you can go back and watch that. And then we have our next one coming up on March 19th.